All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Swish Theory Draft Podcast. I'm Will Morris, and today we're joined by a very special guest, Ahmed Jama. How's it going, man? Welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me, man. It's going well. I'm very excited to be on the home stretch of draft coverage, and the summer is a really nice time because you have all like levels of basketball, like pretty like meaningful things going on as far as the draft on the collegiate front, and then grassroots. You have all the major shoe circuits are underway, and then obviously the playoffs, like the biggest basketball competition in the world. So, yeah, I'm having a blast.
Yeah, good to hear, man. Yeah, so I'm super excited to talk with you, Ahmed, today because, um, yeah, for those of you that didn't catch the first episode, pretty much what we're doing here is just running through all the prospects. I kind of am behind on my evaluation process, so I'm kind of using this show as an outlet for me to catch up in real time with the draft, with the listeners as well, and kind of like take you guys on my journey here. And I acknowledge that in the last episode I talked about this, but obviously pretty big flaws in that process as far as missing some of the like important context of what happens throughout the course of a season. So there's definitely some advantages too. Like you're not really exposed to those like media biases of like, oh, this guy moved up and down like 20 spots in February. So maybe some pros there, but Ahmed is an expert and definitely is someone that um, follows very closely throughout the season. So I'm really excited to have you on the show, man, so that we can really get down to it here. But um, two guys we had on the docket today are Tre Johnson and Kon Knueppel from Texas and Duke, two freshmen that kind of find themselves at or towards the top of most draft boards. I think generally kind of viewed as lottery guys. And the reason I grouped both of these guys together is because I think generally most lists or tweets you'll see will list these two as two of the best shooters in the draft that are also kind of ranked in this upper echelon. Obviously, there's guys that you could make the argument for as the best shooter, Kobe Bryant or someone like that are a little bit more on the fringes. But as far as the real blue chip prospects go, I think these two are as good as any. Um, so yeah, really excited to dive into these with the Med here. So yeah, I think we're gonna start with Tre Johnson if that's all right with you.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, perfect. So yeah, Tre Johnson, freshman at Texas, huge usage player, averaged around just under 20 points per game in the SEC as a freshman. Obviously, super impressive. Measured in at the combine, like 6'4.75. So he'll be like a little bit under 6'6" with shoes on. 6'10" wingspan, so quite long, only 190 pounds, so kind of a lighter frame. But Ahmed, tell me, what do you think about Tre Johnson? What's kind of the overall pitch with him, sort of keeping this shooting background in mind as like the theme of this episode and these two players?
It's funny, like obviously we're going to be comparing the two of these guys over the course of this podcast, but I feel like Trey's approach to his development has been like very clearly intentional. I've seen, interviews and read pieces where he's referred to himself as a point guard. And it feels like his basketball kind of background and education over the past, 3 years since I've shoot, has it really been 2 years, I guess, since I've kind of really been watching him, has been with that in mind, like developing into like a kind of conventional primary option. Like he's run a ton of balls for running, he's progressively ran more and more ball screen actions. He's kind of tried to mix in a lot of different kind of usages and play types, so like amongst that, ball screen usage kind of being the foundation of his deployment offensively, but with the shooting kind of always being the base, kind of always being the part of his game that he could rely on the most and what really separated him from his peers. And to be honest, I'd kind of been less than charitable with Trey's game in previous. I didn't realize it honestly until I looked at like tweets I made about Trey, and it always been like he came in from like his priors, his like high school priors. He'd been one of the worst rim pressure guys of all the high school guys, all the high RSCI. For people that don't know, RSCI is basically just like an aggregate of high school rankings. So of all the top guys that I track going into this class, he's one of the lowest rim volume guys, like adjusted for pace, and then one of the worst efficiencies. And he like just generally not been very efficient. So I kind of docked him for that going into the season. I thought like, there were some flaws in with that in mind that he was kind of trying to develop his game into being, one of the like a lead ball handler. I didn't think he had the athleticism necessarily to be like the a downhill rim pressure threat to develop into that role. And the passing was something I'd also questioned. So I was like, all right, if he can't put pressure on the rim and he doesn't have the passing necessarily it, to play off of the little rim pressure he does provide, I was kind of skeptical going into this season, but he really surprised me, man. I really kind of had to recalibrate my view of Trey over the course of the season.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And I think that that context is super helpful just looking at his development over the last couple of years. Um, and yeah, it's again part of the reason why I was excited to have you on the show today, because I know that you're very tapped into the sort of pre-college scene that I particularly in this cycle just am not. I think most of my evaluation with him has been kind of just this year at Texas and watching what he's done there. Um, so yeah, definitely helpful context to know that he was always kind of this like low, very low rim pressure guy, even in high school. Because I think there are times where you see um, guys that like, yeah, they can maybe like get to the rim a little bit at the high school level, and then they get to college, and you see those physical dilemmas really kind of manifesting themselves. Like I can specifically remember with BJ Boston, like watching him in high school. There was times where like he was generating like maybe just enough of those easy rim attempts where he'd say, "Oh, maybe this is something to build upon," and then gets to Kentucky, and it was I think I kind of had like overstated in my high school evaluation of him, like, yeah, maybe um, that's not really something that was going to necessarily be part of his game in college, and I think he's definitely developing some of that in the league now. He's still obviously very young, but um, just overall, like, what did you make of Trey's rim pressure this season? Because I think just like watching the Texas sample without necessarily that background knowledge that you had, it was definitely like a pretty big worry for me. Um, he had 97 rim attempts and 204 non-rim 2-point attempts, so isn't getting to the rim all the way getting all the way to the rim that much, especially for someone that's in this high usage role. And I think I was just like very concerned with his inability to like really get low and generate any sort of leverage as a driver. I think there's times where he's kind of just upright drives and then throws like a little righty floater kind of right at the glass. And I think there's like a lot of ugly misses like that at the rim. So yeah, I guess overall, like, where do you kind of land on that rim pressure stuff as it stands right now?
Yeah, it's not good. And it has improved considering like his role, like obviously playing in like the toughest, what has been called the SEC this season, called the toughest basketball
Yeah,
conference in
yeah,
college basketball history. I can't speak to how much or if at all that hyperbole that is, but he, I think relative to the competition and relative to the role he was played, like you mentioned, he's really high usage on a team that I imagine we'll dive into the Texas context schematically and the personnel they had a little bit later on, but it was I'd say I'd say it was suboptimal. I wouldn't say it was like the best situation for him, but I thought he kind of acquitted himself well, especially relative to the expect like playing against similar aged peers in AAU. He was doing very poorly, and it wasn't great this season. But considering the level of competition, I thought he improved. And even over the course of the season, it was something that I was tracking, his just general rim rate. And it started off pretty terribly. I want to say it was like hovering around like 13% or something like that. And I want to say he ended the season at a hair under 20, maybe it was like 18, 19%. And a lot of that, it's college, 30 something games, it's a smaller sample. A lot of that was buoyed by, I think he had 11 rim attempts versus Arkansas. A lot of players made their, living at the rim versus Arkansas this season, but I think he did improve. He did get better with it, and that's something I definitely want to give him credit for. I don't think it'll ever be a strength of his though moving into the league.
Yeah, yeah. No, I think it's interesting, right? Because speaking to like his overall creation, I think there's lots of really enticing tools here. Like I think his like side to side shake and like his comfortability as a ball handler is just like pops off the screen immediately. And kind of obviously this is kind of more in the shooting realm than the downhill pressure, but like the way he's just like able to flow from dribbling right into shooting. It's very efficient. Like he's not someone that I worry about like as a pull-up shot maker. So like in that regard, you'd think that he's someone that's going to have the ball in his hands a lot. So I think it's encouraging that as you're kind of noting here, we've seen like some positive development. Um, at the same time, like I definitely want to go back after this and watch some of that high school stuff because I think just keeping the Texas context in mind, it was like a very like large weakness I had listed for him. So I want to see if this is something that can keep developing further, or it's kind of going to remain this big question mark. But yeah, as far as like his off the dribble stuff overall, like I think like I was mentioning, that pull up shooting is a super, super valuable weapon. And I think like, just as like a creator out of pick and rolls, but also like sort of as this off ball guy that you see like running around screens and like getting to like those little like side steps. Even if it's like 1 to 2 dribbles, like that ability to just get to his pull up is phenomenal. On Bart, he had 29 unassisted threes and 60 assisted. So kind of a good mix of kind of playing in this off ball role where he's hitting more like catch and shoots or like running off a curl and just firing straight away or getting to that pull up. So I guess going forward, do you see him playing in this more like on ball, like heavy pick and roll diet type of position, or do you see him more as this kind of like Isaiah Joe type running around screens and firing on all cylinders there? Because I think looking at what he does, like he's capable of doing both at this level. But I'm curious what you think in the NBA his ideal usage would be as far as those like kind of on ball, off ball toggling goes.
Yeah, so my comparison coming into the season with him was Tim Hardaway Jr. was a guy I thought there were a lot of parallels to in his game. And with Trey, I thought it was interesting, just something I've queries I've run on my own little haphazard database and looking for guys that had like his similar kind of physical deficiencies as far as he's kind of a horrible rebounder for his size, to be honest. And obviously, like the free throw rate and rim rate are like lower than you'd want for anyone that was on an on ball roll. And the guys that I found who had done best with all the similar deficiencies or similar limitations to Trey had been movement shooters. They've been guys like Seth Curry. I want to say it was not that he's as much of a movement shooter, but like Malik Monk, Duncan Robinson, guys like that. Obviously, like very hard offensively slanted guys. I think with Trey, primarily, and my hope is that he'd go to a team where they run more like kind of motion concepts and they have him flying off of screens, and then that is kind of like a downstream kind of action or just like a secondary role for him to be on the ball handling like running ball screen actions. I think that wouldn't be something you would want a hot like an efficient offense. I don't think has Trey running a ton of pick and rolls ideally.
Yeah, I think I'm on the same page. Like I think his game is very suited as this like tertiary weapon that can kind of just light it up on any given night. Um, like I do like his like spatial awareness moving off ball, and his footwork shooting off movement is already really good. So I think kind of adjusting from this super huge usage role into this more kind of like off ball gunner is going to be like fairly simple if he buys in. Um, Something I was curious about just because, he was in that like 39-ish% range from three overall this year, which, it's not like you see some of these like Sam Hauser guys that are shooting like 40+% for 4 years in a row. So it's not like he's like way up and high in the 40s or anything, but 39% is still like a very good number. And then when you dive into the film and you watch the shots he's taking, it's like, how did he manage to shoot 39% at
Yeah,
all,
these are not
given what he
given.
was taking? Because there's just some like ridiculous shots in that diet where he's just taken a catch and shoot three from the logo for no reason at all. So I think the fact that he was at 39% at all is just a testament to what a talented shot maker he is. But I also looked and wanted to like kind of sort and this is kind of imperfect just because um, I think it just usage rate as a stat doesn't like tell the whole story, but this was something that definitely caught my eye in games where he had 30 plus usage. He shot 37.9% from three. And in games where he had less than 25% usage, he was at 47.1%. So I think it's going to be very easy for him to kind of even raise that 3 point percentage even higher when he doesn't have the ball in his hands the entire game. And you kind of just turn the shot slider down a little bit and kind of get him to buy into this role. I think the question is that going to be something that he's willing to do because he has been especially at Texas. Maybe you can speak more to the pre-college stuff, but he was very much in this like shoot first, shoot second kind of role on this team. Like there's um clips that I like have in my notes, and normally I mean it's kind of like I'm not even like picking up on these sorts of little things, but him just kind of like clapping for the ball like every 10 seconds, you know what I mean? Like he's
I feel like I've.
always trying to fire it. So
Mhm.
yeah, I mean, I don't know if you have any thoughts on maybe his ability to like adjust to that position with ease, or if there's anything in like the pre-college sample that is encouraging as far as that potential transition goes.
Yeah, so you teed me up perfectly for what I think is so interesting, or the Trey conundrum, so to speak. And please stop me if I'm, stepping on the toes of any like future kind of beats you want to hit. But the reason, like, for a majority of the cycle, I would say I was substantially lower than consensus on Trey. I thought because of the struggles getting to the rim, I previously thought, how much value is there in a guy that I just full candor, I don't expect to ever be a positive defender in the NBA. In fact, I think
Yep.
he'll probably remain just a negative for the majority of his career, even as he adds, weight and despite, having like pretty, solid measurements for his position. But what you'd said with his youth, but then I thought, with the kind of shooter, the caliber shooter he is. And I mean, this past season, at least in like the databases I have access to, being Bart and whatnot, I'm not the most technically skilled, so I'm not someone that's gone through, the annals of college basketball reference and has looked back to, the mid '90s or something like that. But as far as to my knowledge, Trey is probably this was probably the best jump shooting season a one and done prospect has put together this past year that Trey had, as far as just like the self-created diet, the level of competition, the age. I mean, he's a younger freshman, like he just turned 19, I think 2 months ago or something like that. But I think a lot of the utility of having someone like Trey is he can just soak up a lot of usage without and remain relatively efficient. I think what's cool about his shot profile is there's a lot of fat to be trimmed. I think he
Yeah.
had a 40% 3 point rate. I think in the NBA, you want to get that closer to like 60. I think if you cut a lot of those like tough pull up twos, because that's relatively like the only kind of less than impressive aspect of his shooting shot profile is like pull up twos. I think he was 36%. Everything else was like A plus, like 39% on off the dribble threes, 40% on catch and shoot threes. I think if you transition some of those to off the dribble threes, I think that's like an ideal usage. And then if you have a guy like Trey who can generate good offense, who can shoot the ball, and most importantly, I think outside of the shooting, the coolest thing about Trey is he never turns the ball over. I think obviously, like you would, and I think the passing improved pretty consistently over the course of the season. Like the assist rate climbed, and I think some of the reads he was making were genuinely like very fairly advanced. But I think having a shooter like Trey that can like whose efficiency, because you said he was like 38% on games he had
Yeah.
30% or
So it
higher.
was 25 for 66 with 30 plus usage. So that's just under 38. And then 47.1 on 51
Mhm.
attempts. And, obviously it's 66 attempts, 51. It's not perfect, but I think there's a 10% gap there. I think
Yeah,
there's
no,
something to be said
it's
about cutting that fat, as you were kind of talking about.
meaningful for sure. And but I think with someone like Trey, if you have him to where he can like hover around the mid 20s usage, I think it gives you kind of uh the freedom to put more defensively oriented guys around him because he's not turning the ball over. He can like help with that turnover margin. Then obviously like he can maintain a certain level of like just 3 point volume and efficiency through like solely through just kind of like Trey's usage and Trey's shot making. I don't know if that made sense, but that was kind of a long
Yeah.
one.
No, and I think we're very much on the same page there. And I wanted to talk about the passing and just overall playmaking too. That was something I had down about him, just consistently being a low turnover guy. Like he in the games I watched, like did not turn the ball over much. Like I think most of the like decision making stuff that would like be considered like a bad decision per se would be like a wild shot or something like that. It wouldn't necessarily be him throwing the ball away. And I think just kind of looking at his physical makeup too, he has the height to sort of see over defenders. Like he is going to be 6'6" in shoes. And although I think he's definitely lacking in like the lower body strength and like driving and just ability to like generate that kind of leverage, I think he has really good flexibility in like his upper body where he's able to like kind of contort his body and make like those live dribble reads as he's going downhill or attracting two defenders and getting in around the 3 point line and finding open shooters or getting at those kind of like weird angles for dump off passes. I do think he has some like positive physical tools there as far as being like a plus passer in this kind of off ball role. I don't know about if we're like people are projecting him in this larger like high pick and roll usage role where it's like I don't think you necessarily see him making all of those super advanced reads, but I think in this like off ball kind of role, he can definitely be a plus passer in that specific position. So really, really interesting there. That I think we're kind of on the same page as far as that kind of ideal offensive usage with him. I did want to ask about the defense too. I don't want to like harp on it too much just because I think generally it's not good. But I guess the question I had for you is like how much of a liability on that end do you think he's going to be?
I I I think just purely because of the size and the movement skills, and just how like the range he has. I think there are ways you can kind of manufacture him, and obviously, and I think a part of the benefit to how good the offense could be is that you can afford to put like more defensively oriented guys that can kind of cover for a lot of his weaknesses on that end. But I struggle to see him ever being like a div, like individually, like in a vacuum, like a firm positive. I kind of I think he'll probably top out as a slight. I think the best thing I can say towards Trey's defense is I think it is prime. He'll get to a point, and the offense will be to a point where he won't be played off the floor.
Yeah. No, I think that's definitely like the like hope, right? That he kind of gets to this point where it's not like he's going to be attacked like consistently. Um, at the same time, I think the floor is just quite low. I think just being real here, like he is very physically weak. And you see guys kind of like making physical improvements and whatnot, but I just think like where he's at, I think he's just kind of lacking in like that key physicality department. I think there are guys that are skinny that are physical and then they kind of grow a little bit. I think with Tre, I didn't see that many moments of him like being very physical on that end. I think the rebounding kind of speaks to it as well. Like he's a notably bad rebounder for his position too. So um, yeah, I think honestly, like it speaks again to what we're sort of on the same page with here, projecting him as this kind of complementary offensive piece. I think it gives him kind of more of a breath on that end so that he can lock in more rather than kind of using that as the hands on the knees period where if you have like 30 usage you just naturally aren't going to have the energy to really play super hard on defense. So um yeah, it'll be interesting to see. Like I did want to mention like Isaiah Joe again because I think that there's definitely some like potential mirrors and role there. And Joe is someone that um was it was is straight up like one of the best shooters in the league, has been great for the Thunder this season, particularly during the regular season. But um, come playoff time, I think he's kind of seen his role just dwindle a little bit. And even though he is an all world shooter, he just isn't logging as many minutes. And I think obviously part of that is the Thunder are just stacked and can kind of throw in other pieces depending on who they're playing against that matchup better. But I guess in like a playoff specific setting, do you have any concerns about um, that lack of strength and physicality manifesting itself in a larger way than the regular season setting? Or is that even something that I know some people might value that more than others as far as like, oh, this guy's like a playoff player versus not a playoff player.
Definitely. And I think, especially when you're considering the level draft capital that's going to be invested into Trey, that's something I think that needs to be at the forefront of whatever evaluation you're making. I mean, I've seen Trey, not mocked, but I've seen him mentioned as high as 4 in this draft. And I just recently wrote something for like a Sixers base, a Philadelphia based publication where some of their fans are clamoring for him at 3. So, that we could see Trey go anywhere, I think, from 3 to 6 or 7. I think that's the range where, yeah, that's something needs to be kept in mind. I think definitely Trey is. I think he could be, and I don't know. These are kind of like reductive titles to assign to any player. I think he can very much be like a floor raiser because of all he can do offensively, and especially the kind of players you can put around and the kind of like roster or personnel configurations you can make that you can kind of grift off a lot of regular season wins with a guy like Trey. But in the playoffs, it is just really hard to have a guy who the shot quality isn't consistent, in like a playoff setting, and then obviously you're having to cater to some of his like defensive tendencies, defensive weaknesses, and then just specifically something with Trey's defense that I think is the most or gives me the most reason for concern isn't even necessarily like the physical weakness, which is definitely prevalent like on his tape, but I think it's kind of the lack of bandwidth he has as a team defender. That was something that I was always kind of disappointed by, and when we talk about Khan later on, and again, I don't want to jump the gun there, but Khan, I'm not a jump out the gym athlete, and he might, by NBA standards, he may not be a plus plus athlete in really any respect outside of strength, but he's like a very solid team defender. and he can like make like rotations on like string together consistent defensive decisions and rotations. So that's just something I seldom saw on Trey's tape.
Yeah. Yeah. I think we're on the same page there. Like I think there was times where he just didn't look like he was fully locked in away from the ball. And that isn't even including the um, more like directly involved in the action efficiencies where he's just like getting screened out of plays and getting blown by off the bounce. Um, so yeah, I think it's probably a good time to move on to Kon unless you have any other thoughts that you want to get out about Trey.
Not really. Well, actually, this is a question for you. Do you have like a favorite fit for Trey in that top, 8 or 10?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, looking at some of these teams at the top, um, I think it's an interesting question, right? Because I think like the obvious answer would be one of these teams that like desperately needs that like offensive punch, um, which I think there are a lot of sort of towards the top of the draft. Like Brooklyn is obviously one. I think New Orleans could definitely use more youth in that backcourt. At the same time, I would worry that in one of those places, he would kind of get overextended and get kind of propelled into this more like high usage type role. So, um, as I kind of mentioned at the beginning of this whole thing, like I'm still working out my board and figuring out exactly where he's going to place. But I will say, like, I think the player that we've kind of described and talked about is not one that I would be comfortable using like one of these high lottery selections on. Um, yeah, I don't know. I think like Chicago is a team that sticks out to me. Like they're at 12 right now, I think, and they have a big ball handler in Josh Giddey. Kobe White is kind of there in this role, but um, who knows? Maybe they would move on from him or something. But I think, yeah, I kind of like him just generally because I think he's pretty like role malleable as far as this like off ball sniper goes. But I would worry about him getting overextended in one of these like Brooklyn, Washington Wizards type situations. Is there any team like at the top here that like sticks out to you as a positive one? Because I mean, it does seem like he'll probably be picked in that range, sort of despite what we're saying.
At the top, no, and I think the overextended point is like such a key one to make because I think it just leaves him prone to developing some really bad tendencies that you don't want to see, and that it seems like he was, uh, awesomely able to avoid developing in his time at Texas, but no, not really at the top. If there's one, it's not going to happen. He's going to go well before this team's on the clock, and I don't even know if this team's going to keep their pick. But I think just from a pure basketball perspective, the Rockets would be an awesome fit.
Hmm.
Just like keeping in mind the kind of athletes they have in their front court, and I think those guys the kind of defense they can play can mask Trey defense or just cover for Trey defensively so well. And I think that off the dribble shooting element that I think they've kind of tried to manufacture with Jalen Green could actually manifest with Trey, but I don't see that necessarily happening. That's kind of my like fantasy fit.
Yeah, no, that's definitely a good fit. And I think this is such a fascinating lottery too, because there's so many teams that aren't necessarily complete, but seem like they're, like only a couple, even like a team like Philly that was bad last year. Like if Embiid is back, you have Maxey, you have McCain, they're picking at three. The Spurs are going to be good I mean, with Wemby there, like they're going to be contending for the next few years. They have the second pick. Dallas is great. So like it's an interesting lottery because I think there are teams that are like very good that have lottery picks, which usually is not the case. There's like it's usually all bad teams that are picking in
Yeah.
the lottery. So I think that's advantageous for someone like Trey. At the same time, I think the way it's kind of shaken out with like these three teams at the top that I think would be like pretty decent destinations for him if they were picking at like 7, 8, or 9, aren't going to take him at 1, 2, or 3. So I think Houston is a great fit, and I think they definitely lacked that sort of offensive juice in that playoff series against the Warriors. I think it was super apparent, and so much length to surround him with. So yeah, I like that fit. We'll see if he's around by then. I mean, I had mentioned Chicago as a team at 12, so he'll probably be gone before then too. But yeah, we'll see. We'll see. So yeah, why don't we move on to Kon here? So Kon, staying on the theme, another exceptional shooter, very different physically from Tre, where Tre is just a hair under 6'6", very thin but long wingspan. Kon is also 6'6". He's like a quarter-inch taller without shoes, but weighed in at 218 and has an even wingspan with his length, or with his height rather. So 6'6" wingspan. So definitely concerning that he doesn't have that kind of elite length. Shooting, obviously phenomenal. That's kind of the selling point with him. And what I was impressed by, just kind of like looking at his build, like I kind of thought he was going to be like a very like stocky, like spot up catch and shoot guy, but there was like more movement stuff than I initially anticipated. Like he's very good, like setting screens and sort of like backtracking into jumpers, which it's obviously a good sign. It just like adds that like extra level of versatility to his game. Like he's a blistering shooter from the corners, but the fact that he can do more than that is very encouraging. Saw him kind of like hitting shots going in either direction as well. I know that sometimes that can be a challenging thing, like where it's easier to go left than it is right for certain people, righty people or something like that. I think he's capable of going in both directions, which um, is very encouraging to see. So in total on the year, 40.6% from behind the line, 91.4% from the foul line. The touch indicators are phenomenal. They're there. So yeah, what sticks out to you about Kon and his shooting, and what level of shooter do you think that he can become?
Yeah, so the movement stuff is, I think, really important, or just that's a keen observation because Khan, I feel like he's polarizing athletically the way people discuss him, where it's like, oh, a lot of the times I think his height will kind of get overstated. It's like, oh, he's a big wing, and I know Duke, I think even Khan mentioned is I'm not 6'7". Duke was, not necessarily the most truthful about that, but I think some people have also, the dunk numbers. He only had 2 dunks on the season, dating back the past 3 seasons. So like 2 seasons of AAU, and then this season, so I think Khan has 3 total dunks, which is,
Yeah,
which is
man.
pretty ridiculous. But I really do think it's kind of just vertically he's challenged. I think laterally, I even think his first step is solid.
Yeah.
I think he's got a little more twitch than given credit for. But and then obviously the strength, he's 6'6" and 220 pounds. And I think his conditioning is improved since AAU, like the range he has defensively, or just like movement wise, like mirroring guys on the perimeter has gotten a lot better. But as far as the caliber shooter, I think he can be one of the best in the league. And I think how, to the extent, and this is what I'm curious to ask you about, the extent to which you think he'll be able to create his shot off the bounce, or like the caliber off the dribble shooter you think will become, is kind of where probably the mileage you receive as far as believing in his star upside, or star equity, so to say. So how, like, do you think he could get to the point where he is one of the 3 best shooters in the league, or do you think he'll just kind of be one of the better shooters in the league, one of the best shooters in the league, but kind of limited to more of like a catch and shoot movement shooter type?
Yeah, I think that's where I wanted to take this conversation next. So I think that's kind of the next talking point with him, because I think it's probably as bankable as any skill outside of like the Cooper Flag tier. Kon's shooting, like it's like he'll be able to shoot catch and shoot jumpers unquestionably. I think that skill is going to translate no problems. Um, I think that creation is kind of the big question as far as like how high he can rise. Was not someone that was really taking tons of crazy pull-up threes like Tre was this season. Wasn't his role, wasn't something that he was really doing. But I think there was some pretty encouraging things that he showed as a creator where I think I see some handling equity here for sure. Um, like he's capable of playing with pace and pick and roll and like making the appropriate reads, even if he's not like a super shifty handler like Tre is, where he's like changing directions all the time going downhill. I think you kind of see him like coming off a screen and like really slowing down and letting things happen and then making the appropriate decision. They would run him off like curls a lot, and like he'd run from the corner off a screen and then like maybe make like a couple dribbles, and like Malawach was always there kind of in this like roll man role, and they had really good chemistry on those reads in the games I've watched. Um, so like it's good that he can make those pick and roll reads. I think just generally he's someone that is a really good decision maker. He's someone that processes the game quickly. Um, and even if it's not super flashy, I think he's someone that is just a good enough decision maker that you're going to want to have the ball in his hands. I think the question is how much is he going to be able to like score off the dribble? And in that regard, I think put together some encouraging moments on film. I think he's really good at um like kind of like honestly like he was able to like get 2 feet in the paint at like a pretty good clip this season, and he's very good at like hitting those kind of like stop and pop jumpers with forward momentum, like staying on balance, um and just has really good touch, so it translates inside the arc. um yeah, I don't have his exact rim total in front of me this season, but even though he's not like a great vertical athlete, he's not like a athlete, not a big time dunker. I think he showed a lot of encouraging stuff as far as driving to the rim and kind of like stopping his momentum and then getting into like a quick close range pull up.
Yeah, definitely. No, his rim rate was I think it was in the 30s. It was like 33% or something like that, which is like very solid for the role. Like close to not double, but closer to double of what Trey's is. And I think something really interesting with Khan, just touching back on the pre NCAA stuff in AAU, was his deployment or how he was utilized, like in offensively, almost completely flipped in I imagine the way a lot of people kind of just judging him by the optics or like looking. I imagine the way a lot of people judged Kon going into the season was he was like more of a bully ball kind of player. They may utilize his like back to the basket game a little bit because that's what he was in high school. And he had so his post up frequency in his last year of AAU was 23%, and then this
Wow.
year it was 1.9. It,
Wow.
and then his pick and roll frequency, his last year of AAU was, and this is pick and roll plus passes. So it was 17.5%, and then more than double this year. It was, 36.5%. And then just maintaining the efficiency, and in some ways like improving the efficiency year to year. And I mean, as you probably tell, I'm big on it, whether it be macro or micro, just judging a player's improvement over the course of their, career or prospectum, so to say. And I think Khan kind of being thrown to the fire as far as having to play like a completely unique role and then just adapting very quickly was something I thought was really impressive. So I don't want to take the possibility of him developing into like a high volume, highly effective pull up shooter off the table because the touch indicators, like you mentioned, are so stellar. But I am just a slight bit reluctant because I can't really think of a player in the NBA who is like dependent on to create off the balance who is as limited an athlete or create off the balance and like prolifically that is as limited athletically as Kon is. But I mean, he could be the exception. I don't know. I feel like that's that a lot of the times, or at least speaking for myself, I'll miss on guys because you don't necessarily see a player kind of developing on their own unique trajectory.
Yeah, yeah, it'll be interesting to see. Like a name that popped into my mind watching him, just like because you don't really see that many like even wingspan dudes that are like kind of talked about as first round picks. Um, so like Desmond Bain was someone that popped into my mind as a guy that you see creating off the bounce. I think similarly in college, um, it wasn't really like he was drafted 30th. Like it wasn't really expected that he was going to be using that creation stuff in the NBA. But I think especially his senior year, Bain just developed into this really, really smart pick and roll player that got very comfortable handling the ball and was always like an obviously amazing shooter. Um, I don't think Kon is like to the level of senior year Bain coming out of TCU as far as like the pull up stuff goes, but I think that's probably the closest comparison as far as a guy who's like giving you all star level offensive production that um, is kind of limited as far as those like traditional athletic indicators, like just having like a minus or even wingspan. Um, I actually do like Kon's first step, kind of as you were mentioned, sort of at the start of this. But yeah, just generally a limited athlete as far as that like east west kind of shake goes. Um, I don't know. Do you see anything there with the Bane comp? Like, I think it's just a name that came into my mind that I think has maybe some similar deficiencies. I don't think it's like a perfect comp, but
No, yeah, I think that's like a very good. Uh, that's a very like analogous player, I think, in role and kind of what they're concerned. I think Bane might have even had a negative wingspan, if I remember correctly,
yeah, I
coming
think
out.
he's was like 6'5" with a 6'4" wingspan or something.
Yeah, so yeah, I think that it's a fair comparison to make, and I mean, Bane would definitely go in the top 6, 7 of a redraft of that draft class in 2020. So yeah, I think that's fair, and I'm trying to think of other. It really does just for me with Kon outside of like, there's only so much you can gain athletically, but seeing where the handle develops and as far as the playmaking, something I like, I'm not as familiar with Desmond Bain, but something I like most with Colin, which gives me a lot of confidence in his translation to the NBA, is he's such a good proactive passer.
Yeah.
Okay, just comparing it to Trey's a lot more kind of, and it goes back to like how he'd been used in previous settings or how he played in previous settings. He's a lot more like kind of probing, like taking multiple dribbles to find, and he's a good passer and avoids turnovers because of the handle, but I think it requires a lot more kind of like investment, or it requires a lot more like set conditions for Trey's passing to be optimized versus Khan, where he was so good in that kind of like point 0.5 offense, like quick decision making. So I think possibly Khan could even develop into an even better kind of connectory role than Desmond Bain was projected to, at least coming out.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. I just think he's like a very clear plus passer. I think even if it's not like anything crazy, like there was some like minor blips of him even like manipulating defenders, kind of like looking one way and then like hitting Malawach on the roll or something like that. He definitely has that kind of like pace and like under control nature to his offensive game where you see him kind of like seeing the floor and like processing things, but the speed at which he's processing is still very quick. It's not like he's methodical, but he is also making just generally snappy decisions, especially in like the off ball passing role. Like the ball just doesn't stick to his hands. You kind of always just see him making the appropriate read. Um, one thing kind of like shifting away from the offense. Um, you kind of mentioned that, there aren't that many guys that have his sort of athletic profile that are high level creators in the NBA. Um, and although I do like what I saw as far as like some of his positioning stuff on defense goes and his strength, and we talked about that earlier in context with Trey, I do have some worries that, there just aren't really guys with his athletic profile that are plus defenders in the NBA either. Even Bain, who I brought up earlier, kind of in the context of the offense, has never been like a great defender in the NBA. I think he's someone who's improved. Like he was good positionally at TCU, but um, just definitely still has limitations, even with being as smart and as positionally strong as he is. So I guess where do you stand on his defensive projection?
I'm much more confident in Khan's than Trey's defensive projection and the translatability because, like you said, he's a solid team defender. I think something that gets underrated with him, or not maybe by us, but by the general public considering his defense, because there are times, where, and it'll only probably be exacerbated in the NBA where he's asked to make like long rotations and he'll just get blown by on a closeout or something like
Yeah.
that and give up middle. But Khan's a very good rebounder, which I think it's understated in its value defensively, just being able to close out possessions and despite being like a more offensively oriented guy, being able to contribute on the glass and like that with Khan. And I think so. I think as you watch some of the defenses playing now, like you watch Oklahoma City, and so much of their success is rooted in playing like this hyper aggressive kind of scrambling defense where they're trying to force up opponents to make as many decisions as possible. And that's kind of where my, you know, the high, because I've seen Khan as high as two. That's where my concerns are kind of rooted in that. I think that's going to kind of be the defensive meta moving forward. I don't know if he can necessarily play in that kind of a scheme where they're asking Khan to make like multiple, like long, like hard closeouts in a single possession. I don't know if he has the stamina or the foot speed or the length to really contribute in that kind of well, with that kind of like defensive initiative. But I and over the course of a regular season, and obviously it's dependent on what the supporting cast or surrounding players are going to be. But I think he should be like at prime con. I see being a neutral or maybe like a slight positive just because of how cerebral a defender he is.
Yeah, I think that's fair. And I think like um, I agree with that evaluation. I don't think he's someone that you want running around covering large swaths of ground. Um, I do like worry a little bit just about his like margin for error on the ball. Like I don't think he's someone that's really going to be like guarding any quick or shifty players on an island. Like even though he has that strength, like his footwork and balance need to be like absolutely pristine um, for him to survive on that end. But yeah, I really do like his aggressiveness. I'm happy you brought up his rebounding. Like I think he is a very good rebounder, which goes underrated at times. Um, I think he's smart, sort of in those like not like rotationally, but not like covering those like helping in the gap, something like that, for instance, where it's like a shorter rotation. He's good in those sorts of settings, helping on the low man. I think he's not going to be like an unbelievable secondary rim protector, but I think he has the strength and rotational awareness to like provide enough resistance in a position like that. So um, yeah, kind of looking at this player as a whole. I know we kind of talked with Trey how aren't super high on maybe drafting an archetype like that early in the lottery. Um, where are you at on Kon? Is this someone that you could see going? I know you mentioned that some boards had him at 2. Like, is that something that you'd totally be against, or I guess where in relation to Trey do you kind of view him?
I definitely, because of the defense, because of the offensive, like, and defense, so I guess malleability Kon presents. I don't think there's any catering you necessarily need to do with Kon, in at least in until you get into like the absolute highest leverage games. I definitely have Kon ahead of Trey, and it's funny. I kind of took the opposite path of consensus or draft, the draft space, and then I came in extremely high off Kon because of the stellar priors. I mean, yeah, he was in my, maybe not by rankings, but in my eyes, based off of his high school production, was as blue chip as a blue chip scorer can get coming in. I like talked to some people that we work with on Swish. I was like, I think I could have him, 3. I told one of our buddies, Matt Powers, but I've kind of gone in the opposite direction because I do think it's kind of hard to invest that high a pick in someone that I think will probably top out at neutral defensively. So I'd probably say I'd have Kon in the mid lottery, maybe as high, depending on, fit, maybe as high as like 6. But as with Trey, probably towards the tail end of the lottery, maybe even slightly outside.
Got it. Yeah. Um, yeah, I think for me, I'm interested to see exactly where he ends up because I
Very.
still need to do my deep dives on some of these other guys that are ranked um, above him. Obviously, I've watched some of those guys just casually following the draft, but like as far as like the deep film analysis, I'm very curious to see where he's like going to stack up next to like an Ace Bailey, for example. But yeah, I definitely comfortably have Kon ahead of Trey. I think just even if it's not, he's not like the most conventional creator. I think that just with his overall touch level and his comfortability, handling the ball and making snappy decisions, doing all of those things at such a young age, I think there's definitely a chance that he could develop into that like tertiary offensive creation weapon where maybe he's not like the guy running the show or something, but um kind of serving as this like very very good secondary creator that has huge shooting gravity, can shoot off the dribble. I'm not saying he's definitely going to reach that, but I think with him I can see there being more of a path to hitting those like very very high end offensive outcomes, as opposed to Trey, where I think some of those weaknesses, just with his physical makeup and his inability to get to the rim, I just don't know if those outcomes are as likely for him. And then defensively, I think we're on the same page. I think um, even with some of those like physical limitations, I think that Kon, just with his positional strength and just overall awareness, I think it just sets him up in like a higher tier on that end than Trey. So yeah, I don't know exactly where I'm gonna have these guys. I think like in relation to some of the guys that I talked about on last episode, I do think Kon is probably the top guy. Um, it's kind of almost like comparing apples to oranges, comparing Tre Johnson to a bunch of these like long, kind of like defensive focused wings. But I don't know where you're at on Cedric Coward, but I was super impressed going through his film. I'm not even certain. This might end up being like a super hot take, but I'm not certain that I'd take Trey over Coward. Just looking what at my evaluation of him, they'd probably like at least have to be in the same tier just because Trey just has a chance of being such a gravitational shooter. But I know he wasn't on our list of guys for today, but do you have any like quick thoughts on Coward?
So it's funny. He's probably one of the last guys I really got to delve into because
Yeah,
I mean, it was a surprise to, I feel like, a decent number of people that he even entered this draft. But I probably err on the side of Trey because, and maybe that might just be, me being slightly uninformed and just the general profile of Coward. What I have seen, I watched two games of his when he was playing at Eastern Washington. Just seems like a complimentary wing, more of a depth piece, and I'm probably just maybe even overly optimistic in what like you mentioned the gravitational shooting of Trey and how that could be kind of a building block of a good offense. But Coward is one I'd want to TBD. Really, I want to kind of get a better sense of his defense is probably the last thing that I need to really kind of dive into.
Yeah, yeah, totally fair. And I like he's definitely a funky player because I think he doesn't necessarily have like the conventional like blue chip prospect profile. He's old and played 6 games at a high major before getting injured. But um yeah, I don't know. I think just his level of touch on offense, the way he's kind of like improved over the last couple seasons, some of his like movement skills, um, were just really impressive to me. I think there's definitely some like rawness on the defensive end, but with his movement skills and like having that long of a wingspan and
Did he clock in? Was it 7'2"? Was that his wingspan?
yeah, so he's 6'5", just like 6'5.75" or something without shoes with a 7'2" wingspan. Um, so yeah, very, very long. Not like super skinny, but could definitely like bulk up a little bit.
Mhm.
But I think my general like pitch with him and my takeaway from watching him is um his movement skills on offense as far as like his ability to like just generate leverage and like create space and stay on balance while getting into his pull up was very impressive. And he played sort of in this like weird big man hybrid role at Eastern Washington where he was like getting a lot of post ups. So he's not someone that like a lot of his run attempts weren't drives; they were coming sort of on these like post seal possessions. But I think like just showing that level of physicality um, in conjunction with his movement skills and touch, um, and then just having the measurements of just a guy that can play wing defense in the NBA is just an enticing gamble for me. And I think just looking at him compared to Trey, I think with Coward, I can potentially see more paths for him reaching that those like very like high end playoff rotation piece sort of outcomes. Whereas with Trey, I think see him ideally serving as more of this like shooter Swiss Army type. But I think that it's kind of the funky thing about doing the draft the way I'm doing it right now, just because I think if you told someone like in February that Cedric Coward would be ranked above Tre Johnson on anyone's board, probably be absolutely crazy. But yeah, just kind of like in the last month that I've been cramming on these guys, I don't know. We'll see exactly where I end up, but I think I would probably err towards Coward right now. So as far as guys I've talked about on the show, like my board would be Coward, Tre Johnson, Carter Bryant, and then Rasheer Fleming. So yeah, I don't know if you have any thoughts on those guys or if you want to get any last thoughts out about Trey or Kon, but yeah.
As far as Trey, one thing I wanted to mention with Trey that one maybe my biggest reason for optimism in his like high end offensive outcome because I agree in the sense that in just with the framing with him and Coward and him and Khan, it's Trey. I think the majority of Trey outcomes end up in him being like a fairly fungible player. Like he kind of ends up as a more than likely bench piece to like microwave scorer type that and maybe can top out as having a season similar to what Tyler Hero did this past season, where he has a particularly great shooting season, and he ends up being one of the better offensive players in the league for that year for however long he's able to string together like high level shooting seasons. But with Trey, I think within insofar as movement shooting, he Texas I think was 200. It was either in the 270s or 280s in assist rate, and in the similar range in the country as far. And just so the listeners don't know, I think there's 364. From not, it's
Yeah,
364.
yeah, something like that.
Yeah, Division One teams. So they were near the bottom of the country, definitely near the bottom of Division One teams in pace and just general passing talent they had around Trey. So I'm thinking. So my thought, as far as if you were able to play in the NBA with next to kind of jumbo playmakers or bigger playmakers with more passing talent, then you could really kind of enjoy the fruits of the kind of what a movement shooter can do for an offense. But still, that requires a lot of things going Trey's way, and it's just dependent on a lot of like external factors. So, you know, and judging by where he'll be drafted, I can't imagine he'll be surrounded with a bunch of high caliber passers at least in the first year or two of his career. But with the wings, very interested to see where they go because obviously, like it's a position, it's a role that the league places at a premium, and each one of those guys, I think. I'm just interested to see how the league judges or values play finishers versus potential playmakers. And yeah, that's just something I'm interested to track in this draft.
Yeah, yeah, it'll be interesting to see. And I think, obviously there's still more guys to watch and talk about on the podcast here, but I think just like the level of defensive players that those three guys were, and then knowing that, obviously Cooper Flag, we've all seen plenty of, knowing the level of defensive player that he is. I think this draft just has a lot of these guys that can be like very plus impact the defensive players at the next level. I think that's a strength. The two guys we talked about today, maybe not necessarily in that mold, but I think there's guys that can really hang their hat on this end in this draft. And I think those three guys from last episode are kind of a perfect example of that. But um, yeah, unless you have any other thoughts, I think we can probably wrap things up here.
No, good. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, Ahmed, thanks for so much for joining. Really appreciate you sharing your thoughts today. Especially insightful for me with like the pre-college stuff because I think that's definitely a blind spot for me this cycle and with these two guys here. So I think hearing how these guys have sort of developed over the past few years is very, very helpful. And it's just important data points for tracking these prospects. But yeah, really appreciate your insights and really appreciate you hopping on the show today. If you have any work coming out that you want to plug, balls in your court. Yeah.
No pun intended. But yeah, no, thanks for having me on. This was a lot of fun. I hope to do it in the near future on whatever, prospects, you may want to discuss. Otherwise, I hope to be having a piece come out at some point this week or early next week on VJ Edgecombe and Miles Bird. And then I mentioned to you before we started recording, I wanted to get a little quick write up. Honestly, probably going to be fairly redundant on a lot of things we talked about today, but on comparing Kon and Trey. And yeah, that's it. Maybe get out, those two and maybe one other piece before draft day. And that's basically it. It's been a really fun cycle.
Awesome. Yeah, no, we'll have to do this again and talk about more guys on here. But yeah, with that, I think we can wrap things up. Be sure that you're following the Swish Theory on Twitter. And thank you very much for joining us today.
Right.